Before the week ended, something extraordinarily rare unfolded within the walls of the British monarchy. At a high-profile public gathering, the Queen Consort arrived without a tiara adorning her head. To observers watching from a distance, it appeared deliberate, refined, perhaps even progressive. A sapphire necklace, flawlessly coordinated earrings, a serene expression. Style experts applauded the minimalism. Royal commentators theorized about shifting aesthetics. Inside Buckingham Palace, however, fashion was the furthest thing from anyone's mind, because those who served behind those ancient walls understood this was no deliberate decision, it was a consequence. In royal existence, tiaras are far more than ornamental accessories, they are declarations. They communicate hierarchy, power, and authorization. When a senior royal attends a formal evening function without one, it is never unintentional. It signals that something has gone awry. And on this occasion, the reason was grave enough that palace personnel were explicitly instructed to maintain absolute silence. The quiet was calculated. The response, though, was swift. Within hours, hushed conversations traveled through hallways. Senior advisors triple-verified schedules that had already been finalized. Security personnel stood more alert. Wardrobe staff avoided making eye contact. Something fundamental had shifted, and the change was palpable to everyone. What the outside world remained unaware of was that mere days before, the palace had been orchestrating two prominent events, scheduled perilously close together. One was an esteemed literary reception hosted by the Queen Consort personally. The other was a significant royal engagement commemorating the king's official birthday. Both required flawless execution. Both carried profound symbolic importance. Both would attract intense scrutiny from media outlets and international observers. Behind the scenes, tension was mounting steadily. The Queen Consort had assumed direct oversight of all preparations. Protocol, guest management, lighting design, decor selections, wardrobe coordination. Nothing proceeded without her explicit authorization. Exotic flowers were imported, bespoke fabrics were commissioned. Every element underwent rigorous examination. These occasions were not simply ceremonial. They represented opportunities to project authority and establish control. And yet, despite exhaustive planning, one challenge refused to resolve itself. The tiara. None of the pieces customarily assigned to the Queen Consort complemented the meticulously selected gowns. Some clashed in aesthetic, others felt excessively heavy, several were unavailable. As fittings persisted, frustration intensified. That was when attention shifted elsewhere, specifically toward the Princess of Wales. She possessed several tiaras recognized for their balance and symbolic restraint. One in particular commanded attention. A refined piece, adaptable and commanding, long associated with her position and public image. A tiara that subtly conveyed legitimacy without demanding the spotlight. What transpired next was not a request designed to be refused, and the instant it was declined, the palace crossed a threshold it had not tested in generations. By week's end, the Queen Consort would stand before the world without her crown, and Prince William would determine that silence was no longer acceptable. In the days preceding the twin engagements, Buckingham Palace no longer resembled a residence. It functioned like an operations center. From early dawn until well past midnight, personnel moved with rehearsed urgency. Every passage carried the subdued hum of coordination. Lists underwent revision, schedules were recalibrated, protocol officers conferred in hushed exchanges. Nothing about the forthcoming events was standard, and everyone recognized it. Two major appearances, scheduled merely days apart, placed the household under exceptional strain. One would attract the literary elite, cultural luminaries, and international journalists. The other bore the weight of tradition, national symbolism, and the king's public presence. Each demanded perfection. Combined, they allowed no room for error. The Queen Consort grasped this better than anyone. She had always maintained that authority manifested through control, and in the build-up to these events she exercised it completely. Departments that normally functioned independently now reported directly to her senior advisors. Final decisions were consolidated. Nothing advanced without approval. Staff members subsequently described the atmosphere as tightly controlled, not disorganized, but exacting. Errors were not tolerated. Questions received sharp responses. Every detail, from seating arrangements to fabric texture, held significance. And yet, beneath the surface, discomfort was mounting. In royal tradition, wardrobe transcends mere appearance. Clothing communicates rank. Jewelry signals authorization. And at the highest echelon, tiaras are not selected casually. Each one carries a history, an implicit meaning, and an understanding of who is entitled to wear it and when. That understanding had remained stable for years. Certain pieces were associated with specific positions. Others were reserved for moments of transition or symbolic significance. The Princess of Wales, in particular, had cultivated a subtle but powerful visual language through her jewelry selections. She favored balance over spectacle, symbolism over excess. Her choices were intentional, consistent, and widely respected within the institution. The Queen Consort's options, however, were more restricted. As final fittings approached, it became evident that none of the tiaras typically assigned to her aligned with the carefully orchestrated wardrobe. Some overpowered the gowns. Others felt antiquated. A few were unavailable due to restoration work or prior obligations. What might have been a minor inconvenience in another household became a source of mounting frustration. Time was running short. The calendar could not be adjusted. The events would proceed with or without resolution. It was during this period that palace staff began to detect a shift. Conversations halted abruptly when certain names were mentioned. Wardrobe discussions grew tense. Protocol officers exchanged glances that suggested concern rather than confidence. There was an unspoken question suspended in the air. What happens when symbolism collides with authority? For generations, the answer had been straightforward. The crown decides, but within the modern monarchy, that decision had become more complex. Roles were more defined, boundaries more carefully maintained. Respect was expected to flow bidirectionally. Those boundaries were about to be tested. Late one evening, after hours of fittings and revisions, attention turned decisively toward the Princess of Wales. Her jewelry selections had already been finalized for upcoming engagements. Her wardrobe had been planned around specific pieces, chosen not for display but for significance. Among them was a tiara, recognized for its restraint and versatility, a piece that complemented both strength and grace, a piece that in many eyes symbolized the steady future of the institution. To some, borrowing it might have seemed practical. To others, it was inconceivable. When word began circulating that the Queen Consort had taken an interest in that particular tiara, reactions were divided. Some advisors assumed it would be discussed privately, resolved discreetly, as such matters usually were. Others sensed that something more confrontational was developing. The Princess of Wales, for her part, remained focused on her responsibilities. She had always understood that preparation was a form of respect. Plans had been established, commitments set. Nothing about her approach suggested resistance or ambition. What she did not anticipate was to be confronted without warning. By the time the palace lights dimmed that night, the stage was set. Expectations were misaligned, tempers were strained, and a request was forming that was never meant to sound optional. What happened next would expose just how fragile the balance of power had become behind palace walls. The corridor was quiet in the way palace corridors often were late in the evening, not empty but subdued, the kind of stillness that came after a long day of preparation, when footsteps softened and voices lowered out of habit rather than instruction. The Princess of Wales had just finished reviewing notes with her private secretary. Her schedule for the coming weeks was already dense, each engagement planned with care, each appearance aligned with a broader message of continuity and stability. She had learned over years of discipline that nothing in royal life was incidental. As she stepped into the corridor, she did not expect to be stopped. The Queen Consort was waiting. There was no announcement, no advisor stepping forward, no polite buffer to soften the moment. She stood there alone, composed, her posture unmistakably authoritative. Those who later heard about the encounter would remark on how deliberate it felt, as though the timing itself had been chosen to prevent interruption. "I understand you have the Oriental circlet available," the Queen Consort said, her voice measured but firm. The words landed with quiet force. For a brief moment, the Princess of Wales thought she might have misunderstood. Tiaras were never discussed casually, especially not in corridors. They were addressed through protocol, through private offices, through carefully worded requests that left room for discretion on all sides. This was none of that. "I was planning to wear it myself," the princess replied after a pause, choosing her words carefully. I have upcoming engagements, and my wardrobe has already been arranged around it. There was no defiance in her tone, only clarity. The queen consort's expression tightened. You have other pieces, she said shortly. You do not need that one. The Princess of Wales remained still. It was assigned to me, she answered, and I had already made preparations. For a moment neither woman spoke. The silence stretched, thin and uncomfortable. It was the kind of pause that signaled a decision being made rather than reconsidered. Then the tone shifted. Why are you always trying to draw attention? The queen consort asked sharply. Do not forget who I am. The accusation was sudden, and it cut deeper than the request itself. The Princess of Wales felt it immediately, a tightening in her chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with disbelief. She had spent years doing precisely the opposite of seeking attention. Her public restraint was well documented, her private discipline even more so. This is not about attention, she replied quietly. It is about preparation and respect. The queen consort stepped closer. You should know your place, she said, her voice cold now. Everything here exists because of the crown, and I decide what is needed for it. The words echoed long after they were spoken. The Princess of Wales did not raise her voice. She did not step back. Years of training held her steady, even as the meaning of the moment became painfully clear. This was no longer a discussion about jewelry. It was a test of boundaries. I will make arrangements, she said softly. There was no apology in her words, no concession of guilt, only an attempt to preserve dignity in a conversation that had already veered into dangerous territory. She turned and walked away. Behind her, the corridor returned to its quiet state, but the tension lingered like a bruise beneath the surface. Anyone passing through later would have felt it without knowing why. The Princess of Wales assumed, as many in her position would have, that the matter would be handled privately. Disagreements within the royal household were not unusual. They were typically resolved discreetly, without spectacle, without witnesses. This one was different. By the following morning, subtle signs began to appear. Staff exchanged looks that lingered a fraction too long. Conversation stopped when she entered a room. There was an awareness, unspoken but palpable, that something had occurred, and that it had unsettled the careful order of things. No one said anything outright, no one dared. The illusion of quiet resolution lasted until just before midday. That was when the Queen Consort's personal security officer arrived at the royal jewelry vault, accompanied by her senior designer and palace officials. The visit had not been scheduled. That alone was enough to raise concern. The officer in charge of the vault stepped forward, cautious and professional. The items housed there were not merely valuable, they were symbolic, logged under specific care, each movement recorded and justified. May I ask who authorized this? He said firmly. The response came without hesitation. We are acting on the Queen Consort's instruction. The officer hesitated. These pieces are assigned to the Princess of Wales. Protocol requires her approval. There was a pause, then a reply, delivered without warmth. The Princess of Wales is not the Queen. The words fell heavily in the enclosed space. In that moment, protocol bowed to authority. The vault was opened. Under soft lighting, rows of historic jewels revealed themselves, each one carrying decades of memory and meaning. The first tiara removed was the Oriental circlet. But the moment did not end there. As the tray was carried away, another was requested, then another. By the time the vault doors closed again, not one but 3 tiaras had been logged for temporary use under the Queen Consort's authority. News of the action traveled quickly, though never openly. By the time senior advisors became aware, it was already too late to undo. What had happened could not be reframed as a misunderstanding. To those who understood palace custom, the message was unmistakable. This had not been a request. It had been a demonstration of power. And when the Princess of Wales was informed later that afternoon, the shock was not simply that the tiaras were gone. It was that the line she had worked so carefully to respect had been crossed without hesitation. What followed would prove that this moment, more than any other, had set something irreversible in motion. The news reached the Princess of Wales in the late afternoon, delivered with the kind of careful restraint that only made the reality sharper. She was seated in her private sitting room when the long-serving head of the royal jewelry vault was quietly shown inside. His presence alone was unusual. He did not appear without reason, and he did not arrive unannounced unless the matter was serious. The moment she saw his face, Catherine understood. "I am very sorry to disturb you," he began, his voice measured but tense. "But I felt you needed to be informed immediately." He explained everything: the unscheduled visit, the officials who arrived without prior notice, the instruction delivered in the Queen Consort's name, the moment protocol was questioned, then overridden. As he spoke, Catherine remained still, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Only her eyes betrayed what she was feeling. "They were taken?" she asked quietly. "Yes," he replied, "without your authorization." For a brief moment silence filled the room. Not the comfortable kind, but the heavy pause that follows a truth one is not prepared to hear. "And how many?" she asked. "All three," he said. The words landed with unmistakable weight. The Oriental circlet, the Cambridge lover's knot, the lotus flower tiara. Not one piece, as had been discussed, not even two, but every tiara under her care that carried symbolic meaning. Catherine inhaled slowly. Years of training took over, steadying her expression even as something inside her fractured. This was no longer a misunderstanding. It was not impatience. It was not even entitlement. It was erasure. "Thank you for telling me," she said at last. "You did the right thing." When he left, the room felt suddenly too large, too quiet. Catherine sat alone, staring at the far wall, replaying the corridor conversation in her mind. The words she had tried to dismiss now returned with clarity. "You should know your place." In that moment she understood what the action truly represented. The tiaras had not been taken out of necessity, they had been taken to send a message. An hour later she rose with purpose. Catherine walked to the Queen Consort's private office without announcement. Inside, Camilla was surrounded by staff. Her dresser stood near a rack of garments. Her designer was reviewing notes. Senior advisors moved in and out with quiet efficiency. The room fell silent when Catherine entered. "May I speak with you?" she asked, her voice steady. Camilla looked up, irritation flashing across her face. "Say it here," she replied coolly. "I have nothing to hide." Catherine stepped forward. "Why were my tiaras taken without my permission?" she asked. "I told you I would make arrangements for the one you requested. Instead, you removed three." Camilla's expression hardened. "I took what was needed," she said, "because you were behaving as though you were already queen." A murmur passed through the room. Catherine did not flinch. "Those tiaras are under my care," she said. "There is protocol. There is respect." Camilla laughed sharply. "Respect," she snapped. "You seem to forget who wears the crown now. I do not ask, I decide." "This is not about power," Catherine replied. "It is about boundaries." Camilla leaned back in her chair, unimpressed. "You are mistaken. It is always about power." The humiliation was unmistakable. Staff stood frozen, unsure where to look, fully aware they were witnessing something that should never have been public. "You took 3 tiaras," Catherine said slowly. "That was unnecessary." "I took them because I could," Camilla replied. The words ended the conversation. Catherine inhaled deeply. "Then understand this," she said quietly. "This will not be forgotten." She turned and walked out, her posture composed, her hands trembling at her sides. Later that evening, as the palace settled into its usual quiet, a discreet knock sounded at Catherine's door. It was a senior advisor known for her loyalty to protocol and discretion. "I would not come unless it mattered," the advisor said softly. Catherine nodded. "Tell me." The advisor hesitated. "I was contacted by someone from the wardrobe team," she said. "They overheard a fitting discussion." Catherine's chest tightened. "Go on." "The lotus flower tiara," the advisor continued carefully, "is not being prepared for Her Majesty." Catherine looked up sharply. "Then for whom?" The answer came in a whisper. "For her granddaughter. A private appearance, not an official engagement." The room seemed to tilt. A non-royal, Catherine closed her eyes briefly. This was no longer simply improper. It was a direct violation of royal custom. Tiaras were never loaned for personal family use, never to those without official role or duty. This was not about jewelry, it was about dominance. When the advisor left, Catherine remained seated, staring at the floor. The anger had drained away, replaced by something heavier, disappointment, not only in the act itself, but in what it revealed about the fragile nature of respect within the institution she had spent years serving with restraint. That evening at dinner with her children, she smiled when they spoke, listened when they laughed, and answered when they asked if she was tired. She did not tell them the truth. But as she tucked them into bed later, alone at last, the weight of the day settled fully on her shoulders. William was away, and for the first time in a long while she felt truly alone inside the palace walls. What she did not know yet was that this sense of isolation would not last much longer. By the following morning, the palace would begin to change, and the silence that had protected the situation until now would finally start to crack. The night passed slowly. Within the palace, nothing appeared outwardly different. Corridors remained polished, schedules continued to run on time. Staff carried out their duties with practiced precision. To an outside observer, the institution was functioning exactly as it always had. But beneath that surface, the atmosphere had shifted. Whispers moved carefully, never lingering in one place for long. Eyes followed movements more closely than usual. Senior advisors checked their phones with a frequency that betrayed unease. The silence was no longer neutral, it was charged. Catherine felt it the moment she stepped into the day. She greeted staff as she always did, with warmth and courtesy, but there was a subtle distance now, not coldness but caution. Everyone knew something had happened. No one knew how far it would go. That uncertainty weighed on her more than the confrontation itself. In public, she had learned how to endure. Years of scrutiny had trained her to absorb pressure without reaction, to hold her expression steady even when circumstances were deeply personal. What made this moment different was not humiliation. It was isolation. William was still away. His absence was felt in the smallest ways. In the quiet of the morning, in the unshared glances at the children's breakfast table, in the instinct to turn and speak, only to remember that the one person she trusted most was not there. At dinner that evening, the children sensed it. George was the first to notice. "Are you all right, Mama?" he asked, his voice gentle with concern far beyond his years. Catherine smiled. "I am fine," she replied softly. "Just a long day." Charlotte studied her face, thoughtful. "You look sad." The honesty of the observation caught Catherine off guard. She reached for her daughter's hand. "Sometimes grown-ups feel tired too," she said. "That does not mean anything is wrong." Louis, oblivious to the tension, laughed at something on his plate. The sound filled the room briefly, a reminder of normalcy that felt almost fragile. Later, as she tucked them into bed, Catherine lingered longer than usual. She smoothed hair, adjusted blankets, listened to their breathing after the lights were dimmed. These quiet rituals grounded her, reminding her of why restraint mattered, why dignity was worth protecting, even when it cost something. When she was finally alone, the weight returned. She sat at the edge of her bed, hands folded, replaying the events of the past days, the corridor, the vault, the office, the revelation about the lotus flower tiara. Each moment now connected clearly to the next, forming a pattern she could no longer ignore. This had never been about necessity. It had been about testing how much could be taken without resistance. The following morning brought a brief flicker of hope. Rumors circulated early that Prince William and Princess Anne might return sooner than planned. The news moved quickly through private channels, gaining strength with each retelling. By the time it reached Catherine, her heart lifted despite herself. If William came home early, everything would feel different. Not because he would intervene immediately, but because she would no longer be alone with what she carried. She waited. Hours passed. Near midday, she decided she could not rely on whispers. She called him herself. When William answered, his voice was warm, familiar, grounding. "Hello, my love. I heard you might be coming back earlier," she said carefully. "Is that true?" There was a pause, brief but unmistakable. "I am sorry," he said gently. "There has been some confusion. Anne and I will return as originally planned." Catherine closed her eyes. "I understand," she replied quietly. "I know it is disappointing," William continued. "But I will be home very soon." "Yes," she said, "of course." When the call ended, she remained still, the phone resting loosely in her hand. The small surge of hope faded, replaced by a familiar ache. Not resentment, not anger, simply the quiet realization that she would have to carry this alone a little longer. As the day wore on, the palace seemed to grow colder. The tiara issue, the confrontation, the words spoken behind closed doors, all of it pressed in at once. She longed to tell William everything, to speak freely without filtering her pain through protocol or restraint. But she waited, as she always had. That night, sleep came fitfully. And then, just as dawn was breaking the following morning, everything changed. William returned. The sound of footsteps in the hallway, the familiar rhythm of his presence, reached Catherine before she saw him. The children ran toward him the moment he appeared. George clung to his leg. Charlotte laughed. Louis leapt into his arms without hesitation. For a brief moment the palace breathed again. Catherine watched from a distance as William knelt to speak with them, his laughter echoing softly down the corridor. The sight loosened something in her chest she had been holding tight for days. For the first time since the tiaras were taken, she felt steady, but the calm did not last. Later that evening, after the children were asleep and the palace had settled into its familiar stillness, William closed the door to their private quarters and turned to face her. He studied her quietly. "You do not look all right," he said. Catherine opened her mouth to answer, then stopped. She shook her head slightly, as if trying to dismiss the question. William stepped closer. "No," he said gently. "Something has happened." She sat down, folding her hands tightly in her lap. For a long moment she stared at the floor, gathering herself. Then finally she spoke. "While you were away," she said quietly, "something went very wrong." And with that, the silence she had carried alone for days finally broke. What Catherine was about to tell him would change everything. Because once William understood what had been taken and why, restraint would no longer be enough. William did not interrupt her. He sat beside Catherine, his posture still, his attention absolute. There were no questions, no expressions of disbelief, no attempt to soften what she was saying. He understood instinctively that this was not a moment for reaction, but for listening. At first, Catherine spoke carefully, as though testing whether the words could exist outside her own thoughts. She described the corridor, the suddenness of the demand, the way the tone had shifted without warning. She explained how little space there had been to respond, how quickly authority had replaced conversation. Then she told him about the vault. She spoke of the unscheduled visit, the way protocol had been questioned and then dismissed. The moment she learned that not one but all of the tiaras under her care had been removed without her knowledge. As she spoke, her voice remained steady, but William could feel the tension in her hands, clenched tightly in her lap. Finally, she told him about the lotus flower tiara. Her voice faltered for the first time. "It was not taken for duty," she said quietly. "It was meant for personal use, for someone outside the role." William's jaw tightened. He did not speak, but something in his expression changed. This was no longer simply a breach of etiquette. It was a violation of the institution itself. When Catherine finished, the room fell silent. For a long moment, William said nothing. He stared ahead, his thoughts clearly racing, weighing what this meant, not just for his wife, but for the structure he was sworn to protect. "That is unacceptable," he said at last, his voice low and controlled. "You should never have been treated that way." Catherine shook her head slowly. "It was not just about authority," she said. "It felt like being erased." William turned toward her fully. "Explain." She took a deep breath. "You know those tiaras," she said softly. "But I do not think I have ever told you what they truly mean to me." "I am listening," he replied. She began with the Oriental circlet. "It was one of the first pieces I was trusted with after becoming Princess of Wales," she said. "It is not loud, it does not demand attention, but it carries strength. When I wear it, I feel balanced, grounded. It reminds me that leadership does not need to shout." William watched her closely, his expression softening. "It was worn in times when restraint mattered more than display," she continued. "When I wear it, I remember that quiet authority can be just as powerful as ceremony." She paused, then moved on. "The lover's knot," she said, her voice tightening slightly. "That one carries a different weight." She swallowed before continuing. "It was Diana's," she said. "When people see it, they do not just see a tiara. They see her. I never wear it lightly. I wear it when I feel strong enough to carry her memory. When I want to honor the role she never had the chance to finish." William's eyes darkened. He said nothing, but his hand tightened around hers. "And then," Catherine whispered, "there is the lotus flower." She hesitated longer this time. "That one represents change," she said. "Growth, becoming something new when everything feels overwhelming. I wore it when I was still finding my place, when I needed reminding that transformation is painful but necessary." She looked at him then, tears finally spilling over. "That tiara helped me remember who I am," she said. "And it was taken not for the crown, not for duty, but to make a point. William reached for her hands, holding them firmly, grounding her. They were not just jewels, she said softly. They were pieces of my journey. For a moment he said nothing. Then his voice came, steady and resolute. This will not end like this. Catherine searched his face. I do not want conflict, she said quietly. I just want dignity. You deserve dignity, William replied without hesitation. And you will have it. The strength in his voice allowed her to finally let go. She leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder, the tension in her body easing for the first time in days. He wrapped his arms around her, protective, unwavering. I should have been here, he murmured. You are here now, she whispered. For Catherine, that was enough. But as he held her, William's eyes remained open, focused, distant, because he already understood something with absolute clarity. This was no longer a private matter between two women. It was an institutional failure, a boundary crossed that could not be ignored without consequence. And by the time morning came, William had made a decision. There would be no waiting, no quiet endurance, no expectation that time alone would heal what had been done. When Catherine stirred beside him at dawn, she sensed it immediately. We are going to act, William said. Not someday, not soon, immediately. The palace was unusually quiet that morning. Not the peaceful quiet of routine, but the careful stillness that followed uncertainty. Staff moved softly, as though sound itself might carry consequence. Even the long corridors outside the king's private offices felt subdued, stripped of their usual rhythm. William walked with calm purpose. Catherine was beside him, her posture straight, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She did not know exactly how the conversation would unfold, but she knew one thing with certainty. She would not face it alone. At the secretary's desk, surprise flickered across the woman's face when she looked up. Your Royal Highness, she said, glancing between them. I was not aware you were expected. We are not, William replied evenly. But we need to see the king. There was a brief hesitation. Then the secretary stood and nodded. His Majesty will be arriving shortly. Please wait. They were shown into a small sitting area just outside the king's study. Catherine sat down carefully, smoothing her skirt. William remained standing for a moment, his gaze fixed on the closed door ahead, before taking a seat beside her. The silence pressed in. Catherine could feel her heartbeat in her chest, steady but insistent. She had never wanted this moment. She had never sought confrontation. But restraint had limits, and those limits had been tested too far. Footsteps echoed in the corridor. King Charles appeared, walking briskly, a folder tucked under his arm. He stopped when he saw them, surprise evident in his expression. William, he said. Then his eyes moved to Catherine. Catherine. Good morning, Father, William replied. We need to speak with you. Charles studied their faces. Something in their composure told him this was not casual. After a brief pause, he nodded. Come in. Inside the study, the door closed softly behind them, sealing the conversation away from the rest of the palace. Charles set his folder aside and gestured for them to sit. What is going on? He asked. William waited until Catherine was settled before speaking. This concerns a serious breach of protocol, he said calmly. Charles frowned slightly. Go on. Catherine inhaled slowly. Yesterday, she began, her voice steady. 3 tiaras under my care were removed from the vault without my knowledge or permission. Charles turned sharply toward her. Without your permission? Yes, sir, she replied, including pieces of significant symbolic importance. Charles's expression tightened. Who authorized this? William answered without hesitation. Camilla. Silence followed. Charles leaned back in his chair, processing. I assume there is more. There is, Catherine said quietly. The removal followed a direct request the night before. I explained I needed time to resolve it properly. Instead, the following morning, all of the tiaras were taken in front of staff. And William added, his voice controlled but firm, one of those pieces was not taken for royal duty at all. Charles looked back to Catherine. What do you mean? I was informed, she said carefully, that the lotus flower tiara was intended for personal use by a non-working family member. The weight of the statement settled heavily in the room. That is highly inappropriate, Charles said slowly. This was not about jewelry, William said. It was about authority being used to humiliate. Catherine lowered her gaze briefly, then met the king's eyes again. I have always respected the hierarchy, she said. I have never overstepped, but this crossed a line. Charles rubbed his temple, clearly troubled. "You should not have been put in that position," he said at last. "Thank you, sir," Catherine replied, inclining her head. William spoke again. "We are not asking for spectacle, only clarity. This cannot happen again." Charles was silent for a long moment. Then he straightened. "I understand your concerns," he said firmly, "and I agree. This matter should have been handled differently." He stood. "I will address it personally." "When?" William asked. "Now," Charles replied. They rose to leave, the tension in the room easing slightly, though nothing had been fully resolved. As William reached for the door, Charles spoke again. "Wait." They turned back. Charles hesitated, as though weighing something carefully, then reached for the phone on his desk. He pressed a single button. "Please ask the Queen Consort to come to my study immediately," he said. The air shifted. Minutes later, the door opened, and Camilla entered, composed and confident. Her expression changed when she saw William and Catherine still there. The brief smile she wore faded, replaced by guarded composure. "Charles," she said, "you wanted to see me?" "Yes," the king replied. "Please sit." Camilla did so, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "What is this about?" "I have been informed," Charles said evenly, "about the removal of several tiaras from the vault, including pieces under Catherine's care." Camilla's expression hardened. "I was acting in the interest of the crown," she said. "Those jewels belong to the institution." "Acting for the crown does not mean bypassing protocol," Charles replied. "Protocol must sometimes bend," Camilla said coolly, "especially when others forget their place." The words cut sharply through the room. Charles straightened. "That is not how this family functions," he said firmly. What occurred was a dent to the image of the monarchy. It was an insult to Catherine, and it should never have happened. Camilla opened her mouth to respond, but Charles raised his hand. "With immediate effect," he continued, "all of the tiaras will be returned to the vault. There will be no exceptions." He paused, then added, his voice unmistakably final, "You will not wear a tiara at the upcoming engagements." For the first time, Camilla's confidence faltered. After a brief silence, she nodded. "Very well," she said quietly. "If that is your decision." "It is," Charles replied. He turned to Catherine. "I am sorry you were placed in this position," he said. "It should not have reached this point." "Thank you, sir," Catherine said calmly. William stood. "We appreciate you addressing it," he added. Within hours, palace staff confirmed that every tiara had been returned to the vault. No announcement was made, no statement issued. To the public, nothing appeared amiss. But inside the palace, everyone understood what had happened. A boundary had been enforced, and it would not be tested again. The resolution came without ceremony. There was no announcement, no briefing, no carefully worded statement released to the press. As far as the public was concerned, nothing unusual had occurred. The palace moved forward, polished and composed, exactly as it always had. At the Booker Prize reception, the Queen Consort appeared poised and elegant. She wore a sapphire necklace, matching earrings, and a calm expression. No tiara rested on her head. To casual observers, it looked like a stylistic choice, a modern gesture, a quiet evolution. Inside the palace, everyone understood the truth. The absence was not aesthetic, it was instructional. The same silence followed during the king's birthday engagements. Once again, no tiara, no explanation, no acknowledgement. The matter was treated as closed, sealed behind palace walls, with the kind of discretion reserved for moments the institution preferred never to revisit. And yet, silence does not erase meaning. Weeks later, during a formal state banquet, Catherine entered the room wearing the oriental circlet. It rested lightly on her head, understated and precise. The effect was immediate. There was no spectacle, no deliberate draw for attention, and yet those who understood royal symbolism noticed at once. The tiara did not dominate her appearance. It complemented it. It looked natural, as though it had always belonged there. Photographs circulated quickly. Commentators praised her elegance. Observers remarked on her composure, her confidence, her quiet authority. But Catherine did not wear the tiara for admiration. She wore it as a reminder that dignity does not require confrontation, that strength does not announce itself, that boundaries once enforced do not need to be repeated. Within the palace, the lesson was absorbed. No further requests were made. No similar overreach occurred. Protocol returned to its usual rhythm, steadier now for having been tested and reinforced. The incident was never spoken of openly, but it reshaped the unspoken rules that governed daily life. For Catherine, the aftermath was not triumphant. There was no sense of victory in the conventional sense. What remained was something quieter, more enduring: clarity. She had not raised her voice, she had not retaliated, she had not demanded public acknowledgement. Instead, she had stood firm, trusted the right ally, and allowed the institution to correct itself. William had done what few before him had managed so cleanly. He had protected his wife without spectacle, defended protocol without aggression, and drawn a line that made the future unmistakably clear. Some crowns, it turned out, were never meant to be seized. They were meant to be earned.